Frank Worsley was 42 years old. He had spent 26 years at sea, learning the rhythms of wind and wave, memorizing the positions of stars, developing an instinct for ocean currents that no textbook could teach. He had navigated through typhoons in the Pacific and guided ships through the treacherous channels of New Zealand's coast. He had watched men drown in storms that came without warning and had brought vessels safely home through fog so thick he could not see the bow from the bridge. But nothing in those 26 years had prepared him for what he faced on the morning of April 24, 1916. Nothing. The problem was simple to state and impossible to solve. 22 men sat stranded on Elephant Island, a desolate rock at the edge of the Antarctic continent. No shipping lanes passed within hundreds of miles. No rescue party knew they were there. No radio could summon help. The only option, the desperate, mathematically absurd option, was to cross 800 miles of the Southern Ocean in a 22-foot boat to reach the whaling stations of South Georgia. And if Worsley's calculations proved wrong by even a fraction of a degree, they would sail past that tiny island and into the empty Atlantic, where the next landfall lay 3,000 miles distant. Miss South Georgia, and everyone dies. Picture this: a navigator kneeling on a wooden thwart in a boat no larger than a minivan, 2 men gripping his hips to keep him from pitching overboard, waves crashing, 30 feet above and below the horizon line. The sextant, that delicate brass instrument upon which 28 lives depend, clutched to his chest like a baby. The sun appears through a crack in the storm clouds for perhaps 60 seconds. In that moment, Worsley must bring the sun's image down to where the horizon ought to be, snap a reading at the exact instant the boat crests a wave, and shout the number to Shackleton below. 1 chance, maybe 2. The clouds close, and the sun vanishes for days. This is not navigation. This is something closer to prayer. What Worsley achieved across those 16 days would be validated more than a century later. In 2022, researchers found the wreck of the Endurance nearly 10,000 feet below the Antarctic ice. It lay just 4 miles from the position Worsley had recorded in November 1915, 7 months before the James Caird voyage, under completely different conditions, using the same mechanical sextant and handwritten calculations. The most sophisticated GPS systems today, with their satellite networks and atomic clocks, are no more accurate than a navigator who had only 4 glimpses of the sun through storm clouds. 4 glimpses. 800 miles. 28 lives. How did Frank Worsley find himself in such an impossible position? The answer begins with a dream. In 1914, Worsley was walking down Burlington Street in London when he felt an inexplicable urge to turn down a particular side street. There he discovered the offices of the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. He walked in, introduced himself to Ernest Shackleton, and within hours had secured the position of captain for the ship Endurance. Years later, he would describe that moment as destiny, a word he did not use lightly. The expedition departed South Georgia on December 5, 1914, bound for Antarctica with 28 men and one impossible goal: the first land crossing of the Antarctic continent. They never reached the continent. On January 19, 1915, the Endurance became trapped in pack ice at 76 degrees south latitude. For 10 months, the ship drifted with the frozen sea, sometimes covering 60 miles in a single day, always at the mercy of forces beyond human control. The ice groaned and shifted around them constantly, sounds like artillery fire, like screaming animals, like nothing any of them had ever heard. On October 27th, the ice finally crushed the hull. The men watched their ship die over the following weeks, then gathered their supplies and set up camp on the ice floe itself. Think about that for a moment. Your ship is gone. You are standing on a floating platform of frozen seawater that could crack apart at any moment. The nearest human settlement lies over 1,000 miles away, and winter is coming. Shackleton kept his men alive through those brutal months through a combination of discipline, psychology, and what can only be called theatrical performance. He reorganized sleeping arrangements to neutralize potential conflicts, placing himself in the same tent with the most difficult personalities. He maintained routines, soccer matches on the ice, Saturday concerts featuring a salvaged banjo, discussion groups about future expeditions that gave men something to anticipate. He made decisions quickly and without visible doubt, even when doubt consumed him internally. The tent assignments revealed Shackleton's psychological sophistication. He knew that boredom and proximity could turn minor irritations into explosive conflicts. So he shuffled the sleeping arrangements regularly, breaking up cliques before they could calcify into factions. He placed himself with the men most likely to cause trouble, not to punish them, but to absorb their negativity before it could spread. A leader who isolates troublemakers creates martyrs. A leader who embraces them creates loyalty. When the ice floe finally began breaking up in April 1916, the men launched their 3 small boats and made for Elephant Island. After 7 days of rowing through ice-choked waters, they reached land for the first time in 497 days. Solid ground, unmoving rock beneath their feet. Some men wept. Others simply stood in silence, unable to process the sensation of earth that did not pitch and roll beneath them. But Elephant Island offered survival, not rescue. The rocky beach where they landed sat completely outside shipping lanes. No vessel would ever pass by chance. The nearest whaling stations on South Georgia lay 800 miles to the northeast, across the Drake Passage, the most dangerous stretch of ocean on Earth. What makes the Drake Passage so deadly? Geography and physics conspire there in ways found nowhere else on the planet. The Antarctic circumpolar current races around the globe at this latitude, unimpeded by any continental landmass. Wind and water build momentum across thousands of miles of open ocean before funneling through the relatively narrow gap between South America and Antarctica. Waves routinely reach 40 feet. In major storms, they can tower to 80 or 90 feet, the height of an 8-story building. The water temperature hovers just above freezing, which means that survival time for a man thrown overboard is measured in minutes, not hours. Shackleton faced a terrible calculation. He could keep all 28 men together on Elephant Island, waiting for a rescue that might never come, or he could risk 6 lives in an attempt to reach help. The mathematics were brutal, but clear. If the boat failed, 6 men would die instead of 28. If it succeeded, everyone might live. He chose to go. The selection of the 6-man crew reveals Shackleton's understanding of human psychology under extreme pressure. Worsley was essential. Without his navigation, the voyage was suicide. Tom Crean came for his enormous physical strength and his unshakable optimism. Throughout the expedition, Crean had been the man who never complained, who sang at the tiller in the darkest moments, who seemed genuinely incapable of despair. Carpenter Harry McNeish was needed to modify the boat for ocean crossing, though Shackleton privately considered him a troublemaker. Timothy McCarthy and John Vincent rounded out the crew as able seamen. Notice who stayed behind. Frank Wild, Shackleton's second-in-command and closest friend, remained to lead the 22 men on Elephant Island. Shackleton could not risk both expedition leaders on a single journey. The decision must have torn at him, but leadership means making choices that sacrifice personal desires for collective survival. The James Caird required transformation before it could survive the Southern Ocean. McNeish worked with only 4 tools: a hammer, a saw, a chisel, and an adze. He raised the gunwales by nearly 2 feet using salvaged wood from the Endurance. He constructed a makeshift deck from sled runners and packing crate lids, covering it with canvas stitched from tents. Where conventional caulking was impossible, he sealed his work with an unlikely mixture of oil paints, lampwick, and seal blood. The grotesque solution to a waterproofing problem would hold against waves that reached 40 feet. Innovation under constraint, the principle that modern engineering schools now teach as appropriate technology, was simply survival for McNeish. A century later, engineers study his modifications as examples of what human ingenuity can accomplish when failure means death and resources are limited to whatever happens to be at hand. The crew loaded the boat with 2,000 pounds of beach stones for ballast. Without that weight pressing down the keel, the first serious wave would flip them over. They packed sleeping bags made of reindeer fur, already beginning to rot from months of Antarctic exposure. The bags shed hair constantly, working the material into food, water, clothing, everywhere. They brought a small Primus stove, a hand pump for bailing, navigation instruments, and enough provisions for perhaps a month at sea. On April 24th, at midday, they launched. The 22 men remaining on Elephant Island gathered to watch. Harry McNish's wife had sewn a tiny horseshoe into his clothing for luck. He touched it as the boat pulled away. The men on shore said nothing. What was there to say? Their survival depended entirely on 6 men in a boat disappearing into waves that dwarfed the tiny vessel within minutes of departure. Within hours, the James Caird had vanished into the gray swells. Now imagine yourself inside that boat, 22 feet long, 6 feet wide at the beam. 6 men crammed into a space barely large enough for 3, taking turns between the exposed deck and the dark, wet crawl space beneath the canvas covering. The temperature hovers around freezing. Every wave that breaks over the gunwales soaks you through. Your clothes never dry. The reindeer sleeping bags have begun shedding hair, which works its way into your eyes, your food, your drinking water. There is no privacy, no escape, no moment of genuine rest. The salt encrusts your skin. Your fingers crack and bleed. The constant motion produces a seasickness that never fully abates. And the waves. The Drake Passage generates swells that routinely reach 40 feet, roughly the height of a 4-story building. Occasionally, they tower to 60 or 80 feet. The Antarctic circumpolar current races around the globe unimpeded by any landmass, building momentum with every mile. Winds screaming at hurricane force strip the tops off waves and turn the sea into a churning chaos of water and air. Into this maelstrom sailed a boat sealed with seal blood. The first 2 days brought immediate crisis. Ice began accumulating on every exposed surface, the canvas deck, the ropes, the men themselves. The phenomenon was simple physics, spray freezing on contact with cold surfaces. The result was potentially catastrophic. Ice weighs roughly 57 pounds per cubic foot. As it accumulated on the deck and rigging, it raised the boat's center of gravity toward the tipping point. 15 inches of ice meant over a ton of additional weight perched high on the vessel. Capsize. That single word haunted every waking moment. The men took shifts chipping at the ice with numbed hands, scraping accumulation from surfaces they could barely see in the constant spray. Stop chipping, and the boat rolls. Die of exhaustion, and the boat rolls. The mathematics of survival had become a simple race. Remove ice faster than it forms, or join the countless other sailors claimed by the Southern Ocean. The work was agonizing. Frozen hands gripping frozen tools, scraping at ice that reformed almost as fast as it could be removed. The men rotated through the task continuously, knowing that any pause could prove fatal. Meanwhile, those not chipping ice worked the pump to bail water that seeped through every seam, or huddled beneath the canvas trying to generate enough body heat to prevent hypothermia. On April 26th, the sun appeared through the clouds. Worsley had been waiting for this moment with the focused intensity of a surgeon preparing for a critical incision. He scrambled to his observation position, kneeling on a thwart amidships, Crean and McCarthy gripping his hips to hold him steady. He uncovered the sextant from where he had been protecting it against his chest. Years later, Worsley would describe the technique. I peered out from our burrow, precious sextant cuddled under my chest to prevent seas from falling on it. Sir Ernest stood by under the canvas with chronometer, pencil, and book. I shouted, "Stand by," and knelt on the thwart, 2 men holding me up on either side. I brought the sun down to where the horizon ought to be, and as the boat leaped frantically upward on the crest of a wave, snapped a good guess at the altitude and yelled, "Stop." a good guess. That phrase captures something essential about what Worsley accomplished. In ideal conditions, a skilled navigator can determine position to within a mile or two using celestial observations. Worsley worked in conditions that made ideal accuracy impossible. The horizon was invisible behind waves and spray. The boat pitched and rolled continuously. The sun appeared for perhaps 60 seconds before clouds swallowed it again. He had to guess where the horizon lay, estimate the boat's angle at the moment of observation, compensate for the constant motion, and somehow extract a useful number from chaos. Call it artistry. Call it intuition honed by 26 years at sea. Worsley himself called it a merry jest of guesswork. That first sun sighting gave him a position fix, the first since leaving Elephant Island. The calculations suggested they were on course. But one data point means almost nothing when you are navigating through the most dangerous waters on Earth. He needed more observations to confirm the trajectory, to adjust for current drift, to verify that dead reckoning between fixes was accurate. The sun did not cooperate. Days passed without another sighting. 3 days, 4 days, 5 days of gray skies and driving spray. The men settled into a brutal routine, 4 hours on watch, 4 hours huddled beneath the canvas trying to sleep in conditions that made sleep nearly impossible. The boat pump ran constantly, fighting the water that seeped through every seam. Hot meals, when they could be prepared at all, came every 4 hours, a cup of hot milk mixed with water, supplemented by sledging biscuits and the occasional piece of seal meat. Tom Crean became the emotional anchor of the crew during those desperate days. He sang at the tiller, hour after hour, song after unidentifiable song. Nobody could ever determine what Crean was singing, Shackleton later wrote, but somehow it was always cheerful. In the darkness and cold, battered by waves that could have crushed a much larger vessel, that tuneless singing became a thread of humanity that held the crew together. Crean understood something fundamental about survival. The body can endure almost anything if the spirit remains intact. John Vincent began to fail first. The largest and strongest man in the crew, Vincent had been demoted earlier in the expedition for bullying behavior toward other crew members. Shackleton brought him on the James Caird anyway, a decision that reveals sophisticated understanding of group dynamics. Leaving a resentful troublemaker on Elephant Island could have destroyed morale among the waiting men. Better to keep potential problems close, where leadership could manage them directly. But even Shackleton could not manage physical collapse. By the 6th day, Vincent could barely move. His hands were frozen into claws. His mind wandered. The strongest man had become the weakest link. On May 3rd, the 9th day at sea, the sun appeared again. Worsley snapped his second reading through the chaos of wind and wave. The calculation confirmed they were still on course, but it also revealed troubling news. The current had pushed them farther north than expected. They would need to adjust their heading to compensate. The third sighting came the following day, May 4th. Worsley now had 3 data points, enough to triangulate their position with reasonable confidence and project a corrected course toward South Georgia. But reasonable confidence in these conditions meant an uncertainty measured in dozens of miles. Miss by 50 miles to the north, and they would sail past the island entirely. 4 more days passed. 4 days of mounting anxiety, dwindling water supplies, and the constant threat of capsize from ice accumulation. The reindeer sleeping bags had deteriorated into sodden masses of rotting fur. The men's clothing never dried. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes. On May 7th, the sun appeared for the 4th and final time. Worsley took his reading with hands so cold he could barely grip the sextant. This would be his last navigation fix for the entire voyage. Everything from this point forward would be dead reckoning, calculating position based on estimated speed and direction, with no independent verification. He completed his calculations and announced their position to Shackleton. They were close, perhaps 50 miles from South Georgia, if the numbers were right, if the current estimates were accurate, if 100 variables had aligned in their favor. The next morning, May 8th, the 15th day at sea, Tom Crean spotted something from his position at the tiller. A dark line on the horizon, possibly cloud, possibly imagination. Then another man saw it, then another, land. Cape Demidov rose from the Southern Ocean exactly where Worsley had predicted. After 800 miles of chaos, 4 sun sightings, and countless calculations scratched in waterlogged notebooks, the navigator had found a target roughly the size of Rhode Island in an ocean that stretched unbroken to the horizon in every direction. Consider what modern sailors carry: GPS receivers accurate to within meters, electronic charts updated in real time, satellite weather forecasting, emergency beacons that can summon rescue from anywhere on Earth. Worsley had a brass sextant, a chronometer, pencil and paper, and 26 years of experience. His accuracy rivaled anything technology can produce today. The United States Navy, impressed by this achievement, now requires all officers to learn celestial navigation again, a skill that had been considered obsolete in the age of GPS. But seeing South Georgia was not the same as reaching it. Hurricane conditions prevented landing. The men spent 2 agonizing days fighting to approach a coastline they could see but not touch. Waves smashed against cliffs with murderous force. The entrance to King Hayakon Bay, their intended landing spot, was blocked by reefs and breaking surf that would have destroyed the James Caird in seconds. Finally, on May 10th at 5 in the afternoon, they found a gap in the defenses. The boat shot through breaking waves into calmer water, scraping over rocks that could have torn out its bottom. They reached a small shingle beach and hauled the James Caird above the tide line. 16 days, 800 miles, 6 men alive. They had reached South Georgia. But the whaling stations lay on the opposite side of the island. 30 miles of unmapped mountains, glaciers, and crevasses standing between them and rescue. No one had ever crossed South Georgia's interior. The terrain existed on charts only as blank white space. 3 men, McNeish, McCarthy, and Vincent, were too exhausted to continue. They would remain at King Haakon Bay, while Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean attempted the crossing. The 3 walkers carried almost nothing: 50 feet of rope, a carpenter's adze that would serve as an ice axe, and screws from the James Caird threaded through their boot soles as improvised crampons. They departed on May 19th, after a weather delay that tested everyone's patience. The crossing that followed pushed human endurance beyond any reasonable limit. 36 hours, no sleep. Continuous movement across terrain that appeared designed to kill intruders. They ascended 3,000 feet on the first day, only to discover that the route ahead was impassable. They backtracked and tried again. They reached ridges that dropped away into crevasse fields. They descended glaciers by sitting in a line on their coiled rope and sliding. Worsley later described it as shooting down the side of an almost precipitous mountain at nearly a mile a minute. I yelled with excitement. Imagine that scene. 3 men who have been awake for over 30 hours, who have spent months in Antarctic conditions, who are running on reserves of strength they did not know they possessed, sliding down a glacier on a rope at terminal velocity, laughing. This is what survival looks like when you have passed beyond fear into something else entirely. Near the end of the crossing, exhaustion finally caught them. Shackleton allowed a 5-minute rest stop. When he woke the other 2, he told them 30 minutes had passed. The lie was deliberate. Allowing genuinely deep sleep in their frozen state might have proved fatal. Small deceptions that preserve lives. Leadership sometimes requires choices that subordinates would not understand in the moment. And then something happened that none of the 3 men ever fully explained. All 3, independently, became aware of a 4th presence accompanying them. Not a hallucination in the conventional sense, they did not see anyone. But each man felt certain that a 4th figure walked alongside them through those final miles, offering some kind of wordless guidance or protection. Shackleton wrote later, "I know that during that long and racking march of 36 hours over the unnamed mountains and glaciers of South Georgia, it seemed to me often that we were 4, not 3. I said nothing to my companions on the point, but afterwards Worsley said to me, "Boss, I had a curious feeling on the march that there was another person with us." Crean confessed to the same idea. The fourth presence phenomenon has fascinated psychologists for more than a century. Some attribute it to extreme fatigue producing shared hallucination. Others point to religious or mystical explanations. The poet T.S. Eliot found it compelling enough to incorporate into the wasteland, who is the third, who walks always beside you. Whatever its source, the presence accompanied them to the final ridge overlooking Stromness whaling station. At 7 o'clock in the morning on May 20th, they heard a sound that stopped them in their tracks. The whaling station whistle. First human sound in 18 months. They had left civilization in December 1914. They had watched their ship crushed by ice, survived months on drifting floes, crossed 800 miles of the deadliest ocean on Earth, and walked across unmapped mountains without sleep. Now a steam whistle, that utterly mundane sound of industrial work beginning for another day, announced that the impossible journey had ended. 3 men stumbled into Stromness that afternoon. Their beards were matted with ice. Their faces were blackened by blubber smoke. Their clothing hung in rags. They were, as Worsley later wrote, a terrible trio of scarecrows. The station manager, Thorolf Sorley, saw them approaching and could not identify them. He had met Shackleton before, had entertained him as a guest before the expedition departed. But the wild creature standing at his door bore no resemblance to the polished explorer of 2 years earlier. "Who the hell are you?" Sorley asked. And then, in a moment that captures something essential about human recognition, "I know your voice. Not the face, not the clothing, not any visual marker of identity. The voice, that unique acoustic signature of a human soul, penetrated through all the physical transformation." Shackleton's first question after confirming his identity, when was the war over? He had left England at the outbreak of World War I, expecting it to last months. Sorley's answer shook him. The war continued still, with millions dead and no end in sight. The world Shackleton had left had changed beyond recognition. Europe was bleeding itself white in the trenches of France and Belgium. The expedition's struggles, however epic, were dwarfed by the scale of mechanized slaughter on the Western Front. But there was still work to do. 22 men waited on Elephant Island, not knowing whether Shackleton's party had survived the crossing. The rescue took 4 attempts across 3.5 months. Ice blocked the first 3 efforts. The same pack ice that had destroyed the Endurance continued to guard its domain. The British, Chilean, and Uruguayan governments offered ships. Each attempt pushed closer before ice forced retreat. Finally, on August 30th, 1916, the Chilean Navy tug Yelko penetrated the ice barrier. Shackleton stood at the bow as the ship approached Elephant Island, counting figures on the beach. 22 men, all alive. Frank Wild, who had led the stranded party through 137 days of desperate waiting, had maintained morale with a daily ritual. Every morning, no matter the weather, he would emerge from the shelter built of overturned boats and announce, "Get your things ready, boys. The boss may come today." The boss came. Within 1 hour, every man was aboard the Yelcho. On September 3rd, the entire expedition party arrived at Punta Arenas, Chile. 2 years of Antarctic struggle had ended. 28 men had departed England. 28 men returned. Not a single life lost. What does the James Caird voyage mean today, more than a century later? The immediate answer involves navigation. Worsley proved that fundamental skills, when mastered, can achieve results that rival advanced technology. His 4 sun sightings, combined with dead reckoning between fixes, produced accuracy within 4 miles across 800 miles of the world's most violent ocean. Modern GPS does no better. But the deeper lesson concerns human capability under extreme pressure. The expedition failed in its stated objective. The trans-Antarctic crossing was never attempted. Yet the rescue that followed demonstrated something more valuable than reaching a geographic goal. It showed that leadership, preparation, and what Shackleton called optimism, true moral courage, could preserve life against impossible odds. The James Caird now sits in Dulwich College, London, where Shackleton once attended school. Visitors can see the boat that crossed the Southern Ocean, 22 feet of wood and canvas, small enough to fit in most living rooms, tow enough to survive conditions that would challenge purpose-built modern vessels. They can imagine 6 men crammed into that tiny space for 16 days, chipping ice to avoid capsize, waiting for glimpses of sun through storm clouds. And they can contemplate what Frank Worsley accomplished with a brass sextant and 26 years of experience. In an age of satellite navigation and electronic charts, his achievement stands as testament to the power of human expertise. Technology fails, batteries die, electronics flood. But the skills that Worsley carried in his head, the understanding of celestial mechanics, the intuition for ocean currents, the ability to extract useful data from chaos, could not be lost overboard or destroyed by saltwater. Some skills cannot be automated. Some achievements require not sophisticated tools, but sophisticated minds. Some challenges can only be met by human beings operating at the absolute limit of their capabilities. 4 glimpses of the sun, 800 miles, 28 lives. The mathematics of Frank Worsley's voyage remain as compelling today as they were in 1916. And somewhere in the depths of the Weddell Sea, the wreck of the Endurance still marks the position he recorded, accurate to within 4 miles, a century after he scratched the numbers in a waterlogged notebook while cresting a 40-foot wave. That kind of mastery does not depend on technology. It depends on something far more rare, the human capacity for excellence under pressure, developed through years of practice and applied in a moment when failure meant death. Every sailor who ventures into dangerous waters should know Worsley's name. Every navigator who relies on electronic charts should understand what came before. And everyone who faces impossible odds should remember what 6 men accomplished in a boat sealed with seal blood, guided by 4 glimpses of the sun through Antarctic storm clouds. The journey of the James Caird was a triumph of human skill over natural chaos. It remains, more than 100 years later, one of the greatest feats of navigation in maritime history. And it reminds us that when technology fails and conditions turn desperate, there is no substitute for mastery of fundamental skills. Frank Worsley understood this. His navigation saved 28 lives. 4 glimpses were enough,